A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars, they've been wrong about jobs, they've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist, America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. My name is Matt Wingard, and not with me this time is my good friend Doris, who's on vacation, so we'll check in with her in a couple of weeks when she gets back. I want to welcome the Gab community. You can always find this episode and past episodes of the Horrible Deplorable Show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, YouTube, Pocket Cast. We've actually been playing this week on the 405media.com, usually on the weekends at 5 p.m., but I've noticed that we've played a couple of times during the week this week, so that's great. We're moving on up with the 405media.com. Today, Senator Al Franken from Minnesota resigned. This was not necessarily a surprise as the accusers had begun to mount up for him. But the whole issue of his resignation is interesting because the Democrats would have you believe that they're really concerned about the way women are treated and sexual harassment and all of that, and that's why they pushed Al Franken out. That's not really the truth. I do think it's interesting that he clearly did not want to go, and a couple of the women senators had called for his resignation and visited him and asked him to do that, and I don't think he'd made the decision that he wanted to do that, and so every single one of his Democrat Senate colleagues essentially came out yesterday and called for his resignation. So he was on the ledge thinking about jumping, and they just came along and pushed him. Now, why? Well, remember that I talk on this show a lot about 180-degree tactics, the fact that the Democrats don't actually care about any of these things and that everything is just a political tool for them. And I can prove it. Al Franken's resignation is a perfect example of this. They would have you believe that they care about these issues and they have zero tolerance for it, and therefore he has to go. But what has actually happened is that he is in a very weak position facing his re-election next year. And they knew that that was going to be a tough race for them. And now they think that he's injured and they want him out and they want him replaced. And they have a Democrat governor in Minnesota so they can get him replaced here in the next few weeks when he finally resigns with somebody who will be the incumbent for an entire year going into that November election. That's the advantage they would rather have, and so they had absolutely no compunctions about cutting Al Franken's throat. Now, over in New Jersey, they have a senator who just managed to squeak by with a hung jury in a bribery trial, Bob Menendez. This is a man who is accused of going on these trips to the Caribbean where he hired teenage prostitutes. Now, he denies this, but since when have the Democrats cared about anybody's denials? The fact of the matter is, they claim they have zero tolerance for all of this. But see, Bob Menendez is in a state with a Republican governor, and if they called on him to resign, the Republican would replace him with a Republican. So when you step back and watch their actions, it's clear that, once again, they don't really care about these issues at all. They're pretending to, and they don't have a zero tolerance policy. It's all calculated. They would stick with Al Franken if they thought he could win re-election, but because they're concerned that he can't, they're pushing him out now to give an incumbent a better chance in November rather than having a truly open seat or having a weak Al Franken facing the Republican opponent. In New Jersey, they are bending over backwards to protect Bob Menendez because they don't want to lose that seat to Republicans, period. I have noticed that the hysteria level on this whole issue around sexual harassment is high and quite high and getting higher. And I think there's every reason to believe that it's going to continue to increase. It's interesting to notice now that people are being unpersoned who are simply guilty of clumsy passes against women or inappropriate sexual talk. That's enough to end any man's career right now in the middle of this brush fire. Now, as I've said before, I have absolutely no sympathy for Democrats like Al Franken, who have encouraged the creation of these types of mobs, so they deserve everything that's coming to them. But these brush fires, burn hot, and they're going to burn a lot of innocent people along the way, people who have not been responsible for pushing these kinds of mobs, people who aren't as wealthy and insulated as the Al Frankens of the world, or the Bill O'Reillys, who just have enough, or the Matt Lauers, who just have enough money to not be as affected as people down the socioeconomic ladder. Due process is pretty much dead. But I find it interesting that, this all started out as a pushback against men who'd been very physically aggressive, basically physical attacks, and very quickly morphed into, as I said, clumsy passes, inappropriate sexual talk. These are the kinds of things now that are being treated on par with aggressive physical attacks. And, if that's the standard, a lot of people are going to get pulled in to that kind of hysteria. I am curious, at some point, with the McMartin satanic kindergarten, that whole hysteria that happened in the 80s, we get these kinds of hysterical fires with some regularity. It's impossible to know exactly when they burn out or when they're going to burn out, and ultimately what the backlash will be. But I think at some point, the feminists who are pushing this are going to have to reconcile this victim status that they are selling, and this idea that women need special protections and that they're not clearly capable of looking out for themselves and defending themselves and standing up for themselves, which is, one view, but it sort of comes from the much more religious perspective that of, women as the weaker sex, and I don't mean that as in the negative, but just as the smaller, and that it's been the right that has held for such a long time to these ideas that there are sex differences and that men are dangerous and that there's a reason why we give women special protections. This is the basis of chivalry and all of that. And it is feminists who've worked so hard for decades to stomp on and crush and kill this idea that women need to be treated any differently and that there's any difference between men and women, and that, just let women be in the workplace and they can hold their own and they can do anything that men can do. That is not the message over the last couple of months with this hysterical reaction, this idea that basically women have been preyed upon in the workforce. So at some point, these two ideas are going to have to be reconciled. But of course, it's a further example of the 180-degree tactics, right? That there's nothing the left won't do. They'll claim that women are the same as men and that there's no difference. They'll do that on Tuesday to gain whatever political advantage it will bring them. And then on Thursday, they'll have absolutely no problem, claiming that women are being victimized and that they need special protections and that they shouldn't be subjected to the same kinds of rough treatment that men are, or what have you. They'll just turn on a dime. They don't care. Everything is just a tool for power for them. I see that the Mueller investigation has imploded, although you wouldn't know it from listening to the mainstream media, the garbage mainstream media. We now, in hindsight over the weekend, can see exactly what happened around the Flynn conviction. There was this internal investigation going on that had already determined that there were people in the Mueller investigation, FBI agents and lawyers, who were bad-mouthing the president, were pro-Hillary, and who had been throwing this game. I mean, there's this one guy who was actually responsible for throwing the Hillary email investigation and making sure that that never came to anything, and yet he's one of the lead investigators on the Trump-Russia connection investigation. So what we now know is they were clearly not telling Flynn about all of this internal problem, and they were pushing him to get this conviction for lying to the FBI because they knew this other information that was going to taint the entire investigative process was going to come out. So they get him to accept the conviction on a Friday, and then I'm sure they did some of their own leaking on Saturday, because Saturday's a great time for bad stories to come out because nobody's paying attention to the news on Saturday. So they let all of this information about how tainted it is, that so many of the people involved in the Mueller investigation are pro-Hillary and anti-Trump and have been basically unethical from the get-go. They let all that come out on Saturday to get it out because they knew it was going to come out in the IG's report anyway. So what's clear is that if Flynn had known any of that and his attorneys had known any of that, he wouldn't have pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI on Friday. So it's a nice little swamp game that they're all playing. And anyone with an honest bone in their body understands that this investigation is a complete farce and that it's run by hacks and very anti-Trump folks, and it needs to be shut down. I actually think that the move that the president should make at this point is to pardon Flynn. And I wouldn't recommend that he give him a blanket pardon. He should simply pardon him for lying to the FBI. So everybody's going to squawk and claim that he's trying to cover his tracks or he's trying to thwart the investigation. But in what way would he be doing that? Essentially, if they have other crimes that Flynn committed, they're free to still charge him with those and to prove those. But since 2 of Hillary's own people were given immunity, and they clearly lied to the FBI, and nothing ever came out of that, there's a double standard here. The president should just pardon Flynn. And I think he ultimately wins that going forward. There'll be a tremendous amount of fire and heat in the days immediately after the pardon, but I think people will see the wisdom of it, especially when it's clear that he hasn't given him a blanket pardon from any other crime he might have committed. He's simply pardoning him on that. The other thing that does is it prevents it gives Flynn no incentive to cooperate with the FBI. If he felt like he needed to do this because they were bankrupting him, by being pardoned on that crime, he doesn't need to tell the FBI or Mueller's investigation anything anymore. He can set about trying to reconstruct his life and earn back some of the money he's lost having to pay all these attorneys. So the president this week announced that the United States would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and that sometime probably next year the physical embassy would move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I saw that lots of Democrats were condemning that action, even though they had voted for the bills that authorized that. This is a classic example, once again, of the swamp in action, trying to have it both ways. People in D.C., in order to curry favor with the Jewish lobby and to get all of that money and support, had been supporting bills that said explicitly that the United States was going to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and then it allowed the president to delay that decision, I think, by 6 months at a time. And so for a couple of decades, that's what every president's been doing, is simply the law's on the books, but they've been delaying the announcement. And this allows everybody in D.C. to have it both ways. They can claim they voted for it. Every presidential candidate in the last 25 years has actually run on the idea that when they're president, they will actually move the embassy to Jerusalem and recognize the capital, but none of them ever do it. That's just a classic Barbra Streisand that's been going on in D.C., and Trump has made it clear from the beginning that he's not that kind of person and that he says what he means. And so he said he was going to do it on the campaign trail, and he's doing it. So you have Democrats who voted for the bill saying that this should happen, now whining and complaining that the president actually did it. And then you have the claims that this is going to inflame the Mideast. I invite anyone to look at the Mideast and tell me how it can become any more inflamed. I mean, Obama and his cronies, Hillary Clinton, set about essentially undermining all of the dictators within the region, and they essentially allowed the whole place to collapse. I highly doubt that recognizing Jerusalem as the capital is going to further inflame the Mideast. And then there's the claim that it somehow sets back the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. What Palestinian-Israeli peace process? Everybody's pretended that there's a peace process for decades. There have been constant jabbering and talking, and nothing's ever come out of it. The Palestinians have no interest in compromising, so there's been no movement of any kind. And the only thing that's actually changed conditions on the ground is unilateral action by the Israelis. When, in order to stop the attacks, they built the wall. The attacks have stopped. It's clear that essentially the United States and Israel and whichever countries in the world want to cooperate are going to have, if there's going to be any kind of a two-state solution or anything like that, it's simply going to have to be imposed. And the boundaries are all just going to have to be decided on our side, because the Palestinians are never going to sit down and negotiate, because a negotiation requires a compromise. And any kind of real compromise is going to require the Palestinians to give up on the idea that they're going to return, the right of return to Israel, or that they're going to annihilate the Israeli state. And, once you give up on those things, a two-state solution can fall together pretty quickly. But the Palestinians have no intention of doing that. So whatever solution is going to occur, it's simply going to have to be imposed. And then only time allows the cement to dry on that reality. I also find it interesting that the same people who constantly tell us that Islam is a religion of peace are also the people who are constantly telling us that we have to walk very softly around Quran burning and pictures of Muhammad and anything that favors the Israelis, because it could all just set off these Muslims. And, you can inflame the Middle East. Well, if it's a religion of peace, why do we always have to tiptoe around Muslims in the Mideast? Tillerson is taking shots in the garbage press about how he's depopulating the State Department. I say good for him. There's all these pulling of hair, gnashing of teeth articles in the various large liberal newspapers from all of these anonymous State Department people whining that he's not filling all the positions and that they've downsized so much. So it looks like Tillerson was true to his word. He is attempting to get at that 30% cut that they want. I don't think they're going to get 30%, but the point is that he's doing what they're doing throughout a lot of the Trump administration, which is they're achieving some of these budget cuts by simply refusing to fill the positions. So the GOP in Congress doesn't seem willing to do much in the way of actual budget cutting. I think the best case scenario in any department is around 5%, but even then, a lot of the cuts are simply cuts in growth. And Trump wanted 30% cuts, and I think, they're not going to get to 30%, but a lot of the way they're going to get past congressionally approved budgets is they're just simply not going to spend the money. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out over a year or two or three when a lot of these departments are going to have excess funds because they didn't actually spend them. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on the GOP to actually cut those budgets because these departments are going to be functioning on less money, proving that they don't need it. So that will take some time to play out, but it will be very interesting. And certainly Rex Tillerson is improving his grade in the scorecard that we will be doing in January. We did a 6-month review of the administration and the cabinet members, and I can tell you right now, as a spoiler alert, that Scott Pruitt at the EPA is going to maintain his A+, because what he's doing over there is just phenomenal. And I wish that all of the other cabinet members would take a cue from him, but too many of them are swamp creatures. But when we do the reevaluation in January, I have no doubt that my grade for Rex Tillerson is going to improve because he has been very quietly implementing changes at the State Department. And the best way to judge whether or not a cabinet member is actually a real Trump supporter who is doing what the president wants and draining the swamp and all the things we've asked for is to simply Google that agency and see if the mainstream press is doing, hair on fire stories about the employees there saying the world's coming to an end. If you're, as a cabinet member, if you're not generating those kinds of stories in the garbage press in which anonymous employees in your department are claiming that the apocalypse is coming because of what you're doing, then you're clearly not doing your job. That's the best way to know whether a cabinet member is really changing the conditions on the ground and fundamentally altering these departments. Earlier this week, the Supreme Court of the United States refused to continue the injunction on Trump's travel ban. Now, this is actually a sign that they intend to uphold his travel ban, something that we said from the very beginning would happen. Once again, the Ninth Circus has been overturned because that's just filled with garbage judges who are constantly trying to bend and eviscerate the Constitution. They would not let the injunction go if there was even a chance that they would uphold the criticisms of the travel ban. It's clear that the ultimate decision from the Supreme Court on the travel ban is going to be lopsided, a lopsided vote in favor of the president, because if they thought there was a chance, if the liberals or whoever on the court wants to shoot down the travel ban, if they thought there was even a remote prayer that they would get the 5 votes they needed, then the injunction would have been maintained. So that's a clear signal that that's going to go the president's way when they ultimately rule. And it will be a fait accompli anyway, because without the injunction, the travel ban goes into effect. So if some months down the line, the Supreme Court decides that the travel ban is perfectly constitutional, which it is, it won't change anything because the travel ban will have already been in effect for months. So the president wins bigly, as everyone who wasn't on their knees with Trump derangement syndrome understood from the beginning. The Constitution and the immigration laws give the president wide latitude when it comes to foreigners coming in and out of the country. The president was always on firm ground in issuing his travel ban, and ultimately the Supreme Court has agreed. #winning. Speaking of the Supreme Court, I see that they also took up the issue of the baker, the wedding cake baker, who didn't want to bake the cake for the gay wedding and eventually got fined, and this is appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it looks like Justice Kennedy was siding with the baker, at least leaning that way, and so you have the left kind of freaking out at the idea that there may be a decision that would allow people to exercise their religious convictions and to not be forced to bake the cake and to participate in a gay wedding. Interestingly, it looks like the argument that the baker's attorney was trying to make is that this is artistic expression. And the reason he's or she is doing that is that this all goes back to the public accommodations section of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. One of the elements, besides the trying to stop the poll taxing and the things that were preventing blacks from being able to vote, and that there was other forms of discrimination going on, there was the whole idea that businesses like Woolworths weren't allowing blacks to sit at the lunch counter. And so one section of the Civil Rights Act, the Public Accommodations Act, essentially said that if you operate a business, a hotel, restaurant, what have you, that it has to be open to people of all races, that you cannot exclude people on the basis of race. Now, interestingly, that was the reason that Barry Goldwater voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He actually supported all the other elements of the act that protected their ability to vote and that ended all discrimination within the government, desegregating the schools, all of that he supported. But ultimately, he thought it was unconstitutional to tell people who run private businesses what they can and cannot do or who they have to serve. And so for that reason and that reason alone, he opposed the Civil Rights Act. And then even though he'd helped to start the Arizona chapter of the NAACP and was a strong defender of black rights, he got labeled as a racist and tarred during the whole 1964 election and the rest. And for many, many years was tarred that way because he'd voted against the Civil Rights Act. But he had this one problem with one section of the act. That was actually something that Rand Paul mentioned during the last presidential election back in 2012, that he had a problem with that public accommodations piece, and then he quickly had to walk that back and say that he supported all elements of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Part of the consternation from that is that, of course, as every other interest group has been added, as the idea that people based on their sexual orientation or sex or what have you, and this is ultimately going to be expanded to transgender and the rest, this Public Accommodations Act essentially forces everyone in the business community to not be able to discriminate on basically any category whatsoever. And so it's all of the fears that Barry Goldwater originally expressed about the way that this one tool to alleviate discriminations against blacks, which was so obvious, the remedy could be used over time and expanded to basically punch a giant hole in the Constitution. Well, he was correct. And it's interesting that this is the crux of the issue in front of the Supreme Court. So the lawyers for the baker are basically trying to get around the public accommodations piece by arguing that their client is expressing himself artistically, that when he bakes these cakes, that they're unique pieces of art, and that therefore it's essentially kind of to the side of public accommodations, that you can't force someone to make an artistic expression that they don't want to, sort of a combination of the religious artistic argument. And he may very well win the day on this. It'll be interesting to see, though, if the Supreme Court essentially, because the lawyer sort of gave him this opportunity, finds a way to side with the baker from an artistic standpoint and then basically creates a very narrowly tailored exemption in which you have to prove that what you're doing is artistic in some way or another, or otherwise you're still forced to comply with the public accommodations law. I think that this is maybe not going to come to a head now, but ultimately this is an issue that will have to be resolved, because this argument, this public accommodations argument, is essentially used as a hammer to force people to accept anything. And what might have been a very, very good argument to address very obvious discrimination and historical discrimination against blacks in the United States is now, once that camel's nose under the tent, essentially, once that was created in law, it's now used for anybody that has a grievance to come and force a business to do what they want them to do. So we'll have to pay attention to that over the long term. That could end up being a decision that neither side is satisfied with, because if the justices essentially create kind of a narrow exemption based on the baker being an artist, then they will have solved the problem. They'll have taken one of the right's best arguments of, bake the cake. This has been a rallying cry to sort of show the inherent injustice of the public accommodations law. They'll have taken that off the table and still have left 99.9% of the public accommodations law intact. So it could be kind of a Pyrrhic victory for the right, for basically the anti-left, because it will take the baker's issue off the table without really dealing with these issues of religious people have basically been trying to make the argument that they don't want to have to act against their conscience. And the Supreme Court may essentially decide that they're only going to give that exemption to an artist, not necessarily a religious conviction. So it will be an interesting decision. We'll have to see exactly how it's worded when it comes down. So the Senate and House are getting ready to go to conference on the tax cut bill. I see that it's already being floated out there that the corporate rate's going to go from 20 to 22%. If they float it out there, then that's what's going to happen. It's too bad. 20% was a good number. I wish that they would have stuck to that. I think allowing it to creep back doesn't make a lot of sense, especially since the president essentially only wanted this. He gave up pretty much anything else that the Republicans in the House and the Senate wanted in exchange for the corporate rate, which he wanted down to 15%, and then originally said, or early on said, that he would be willing to compromise to 20%. And now he's allowing himself to be moved another couple of points. It's still a huge cut on the corporate rate, but I think for bargaining purposes, he shouldn't have moved off of the 20%. Let them, his tactic has been from the beginning, you can stuff anything else you want into these bills, but it needs to come down to 20% or less. And of course, they always wanted there to be middle-class tax cuts in there because they didn't want it to be a naked corporate tax cut. In my mind, he should have stuck to the 20% so that in future negotiations, it's clear that when he sets a parameter, he's not going to move off of that. So this is not, for the president, it's a big win. And for the economy, it absolutely will be a big win. So he's going to benefit from this in the ensuing years as this corporate rate drives a lot of growth in the economy. But from a political standpoint, it's really not much of a win. As I've talked about before, this is part of the president's agenda, and it's perfectly fine if it's vegetables. You mix the vegetables in with the mashed potatoes. You cannot just pass the corporate tax cut and then not get the wall and not get other key, repealing and replacing Obamacare and other key things that are much more important to the base. So there's what's good for the economy, and then there's what you've got to do politically. And it looks like the Republicans think that maybe by passing concealed carry reciprocity, that they're going to provide some cover so that the tax cuts are not quite as naked. The corporate tax cut is not as naked. The reciprocity bill is great. That's fantastic. That's good news. Certainly, I have nothing but positive things to say about it. I just don't think that it's enough. It appeals to, obviously, concealed carry permit holders, but that's not necessarily a broad enough swath of the electorate when you're going into the 2018 election cycle. In the tax cut bill, it looks like they're going to have kind of a pro and a con on the Obama thing. They're going to repeal the individual mandate, which essentially makes Obamacare voluntary. But at the same time, they're already signaling that they're going to put in the bailout for the insurance companies, which I think is a mistake, but they're going to do what they're going to do. I think if at the end of the year they have this tax cut at 22% and they have Obamacare mandate repealed, but the bailout for insurance companies in there, and they have reciprocity for concealed carry permit holders, I would say they do not have enough to avoid a disastrous result going into the 2018 election cycle. So it's going to be on them in the first 6 months or so to get some other significant stuff accomplished. And of course, they will completely eviscerate all of their hopes if they pass any kind of DACA amnesty. And I saw that Jeff Flake supplied his vote for the tax cut, saying to reporters that he had an under-the-table agreement for DACA amnesty in exchange for his vote. I hope that that's not true, or I certainly hope that if someone said that he is betrayed on that issue, because I think it is a catastrophic mistake for the Republicans to pass any kind of a DACA amnesty. And I have a concern that folks in D.C. think that getting wall funding is a good compromise in exchange for DACA amnesty. That's a terrible trade. That's a terrible trade. The idea that, and this is going to be millions of people are going to be given amnesty under DACA, that is a huge, huge give to the left. And I'm the first person to make the argument that everything has to be on the table in a negotiation. My argument with Republicans is not that compromise is bad, but that they make lousy bargains. They often trade away short-term gains for long-term gains for the left. And I've, of course, come to believe in the last couple of years that what I thought was just lousy negotiating is actually purposeful, and that the GOP has been selling us out on purpose for their own money and careers and what have you. They don't really care about these issues. So when you have Tom Cotton talking about ending chain migration, that does help on any kind of a DACA compromise if it's only going to be the children, but of course they're still going to bring their immediate family members in. It still ends up being millions and millions of people. And I think ultimately you would have to have a much more tailored program so that the vast majority of DACA children actually couldn't qualify. Maybe those who'd gotten certain advanced degrees and had served in the military, a very narrowly tailored bill in exchange for ending chain migration, getting E-Verify. If you can get a dramatic change in the immigration system going forward, which would then apply to all future administrations, that's the kind of thing to sit down and have a conversation about when it comes to DACA. But I think that the president has the leverage right now. DACA is going to expire. He can deport. You don't have to give every single DACA recipient amnesty, because right now they're all looking at deportation. I think you can extract a very good lopsided deal in which you get a wholesale overhaul of the immigration system, ending chain migration, plus funding for the wall, and you only give some top-notch DACA recipients amnesty, or you don't make a deal. At the end of the day, you don't make a deal, because then you can continue to deport and build the wall. So I'm not opposed to the idea of a deal, but the chances are 99% that the kind of deal that the Republicans, as currently constituted in Congress, will make will be a lousy deal. And so it must be opposed. It must be vigorously opposed. And I think that Republicans are headed for major losses in 2018 if they make a lousy deal, which they're likely to do. So we'll have to keep our eye on that and be ready to man the ramparts and push back on it. Again, I remain saddened that it is the House that will likely be punished in the 2018 election, just based on who's up in the Senate. There's virtually no chance Republicans are going to lose the Senate. It's a matter of how many seats they're going to pick up. It could be 0, it could be 1 or 2. In an absolutely extreme scenario, they could get to 60, but I think that is extremely unlikely. I think, 55, 53, these are all numbers that are much, much more likely. You're going to lose some seats and gain some others. But because basically it's a lot of Democrats in red states that are up for re-election, it's almost impossible for Senate Republicans to get to 60 or to lose their majority. So voters, if what appears to be happening is happening, which is that you have Democrats highly energized because this constant hate rhetoric against the president has them very, very energized, and you've demoralized Republicans because the House and Senate cannot get the Trump agenda passed, then I think you're headed for some significant losses. And what will happen is it's the House that will be lost to the Democrats, not the Senate. And again, I think that's a shame. I'm not a fan of Paul Ryan and the leadership in the House, but I will say this. They have passed the Trump agenda. There's almost nothing on the list that hasn't made its way through the House and been passed. These bills have gone to the Senate where they have died. And it is the Senate that has let us down. And again, it's just a shame to see that some decent Republicans in the House are going to lose their seats, and it's possible that Republicans will lose the majority in the House because the Senate would not act, because of Senate Republicans like John McCain and Flake and Corker and Heller and people like that. I will be doing some kind of a report card near the end of the year or early next year, identifying the worst Republicans in the House. I got another item for my scorecard when about 34 of them published a letter to the Speaker calling for a DACA compromise. So it's pretty easy to identify those 34 as never-Trumpers. But I have some other key votes or statements that have been made over the course of the year that allows me ultimately to create a scorecard and give some F grades to some House Republicans that should be challenged in their primaries and removed. And I just need to sit down and work through that material and come up with it. Maybe I'll even publish it on the website, thedailystir.com. So stay tuned. Might end up being a shorter broadcast than we normally do, but I wanted to give some Christmas movie recommendations since we're in the month of December. But before I do that, I did see something on Netflix the other night that I must recommend. It's a documentary called Icarus, Icarus. And if you have Netflix, I highly encourage you to watch this fascinating documentary about the Russian doping program. It's such an odd and interesting documentary because the guy who made it was a cyclist, and the documentary started out as one thing and then turned into another. Originally, he just wanted to prove that you could dope and get away with it. That was sort of the point of the documentary. And he wanted to enter a cycling competition in the Alps and do a doping program beforehand and show that he had, he had improved his performance from the year before. And so he ended up it was recommended to him that he contact this Russian who runs the lab testing facility in Russia, and that he work with him. And so he was documenting this process of working with him, and the guy was walking him through how to dope and do all of that. And this is the guy that heads the lab in Russia, so it's already obviously a hint of what's to come. And he ends up, the documentary for the first 20 or 30 minutes is about this attempt to dope and then do better in this cycling event in the Alps. But what ends up happening is that the whole doping scandal around the Russians breaks loose while he's doing this documentary. And the gentleman that he is working with is at the center of the whole thing and ends up having to flee Russia for his life, and ends up coming to live with the guy who's making the documentary in Los Angeles. And so then the whole documentary turns and becomes about what has been going on in Russia. And it is extremely well documented. Without question, the Russians have been running a doping program. And as he makes clear, it goes back to the 60s. They've never not been doping. And it isn't just Olympic sports, it's all of their athletes, period. And the documentary it's fascinating. It's fascinating because of how it starts as one thing and kind of essentially becomes something enormous, becomes a New York Times story. I mean, this guy is at the center of an enormous scandal that's happening worldwide. But it's also a window into the truth about what's going on with athletics at the highest level. And it's a little bit, it's obviously entirely about Russia, but I think that ultimately the documentary is about a lot more than just Russia's doping program. And again, I highly recommend it. It's fascinating, hour-and-a-half documentary. Now on to the Christmas recommendations. I actually have 3 movies that I enjoy watching around Christmas time, all of which are well known, but probably most people would only agree with me on 2 of them. My absolute favorite Christmas movie is the 1970 musical Scrooge, starring Albert Finney. Now, there have been a number, just countless versions of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. The Muppets have done it. There have been a bunch of straight versions, and this is the only one that's a musical. I think at one time Hallmark or one of those did a version with a female Scrooge. And I mean, this has been done sideways and up and down and left to right in every direction. Of all of them, my absolute favorite is the musical. Directed by Ronald Neame, who directed things like Poseidon Adventure and the Odessa File. It was a British producer-director for a long time, produced Great Expectations, the original 1946 version, which is a wonderful movie. I actually got the chance to meet, or at least to listen to Ronald Neame when I was at SC. I do not remember what movie was being screened, but he came and answered questions afterwards, and it was just a delight to listen to, and it was a pleasure to shake his hand and tell him how much I loved this movie that he didn't get a lot of credit for. I mean, it was not a strong box office performer. The critics didn't particularly like it when it came out in 1970, but it has gotten a lot of play on television over the years, and I think people are generally familiar with it. I love it because I think it does a really good job of sort of capturing the feel of the time period. It's gritty, and it feels more honest than a lot of the other versions that have been done. And of course, I have no problem with musicals. I have no problem with the concept of musicals, and I have a lot of musicals that I like. But of course, there's a lot of musicals I don't like. Some people are just completely turned off by musicals because the idea of people singing just doesn't make any sense. The only way to understand a musical is that people sing when the emotion that they're feeling is too great to be expressed just in talking. So whether it's a happy or a sad or an anger or an excited feeling, whatever it is, it's just too overwhelming to simply speak it. And so they break into song. And if you think of it that way, that's the best way to understand musicals as you watch them, is it's kind of an internal feeling that somebody's having, and it's coming out expressed in song. Anyway, at the time, critics said that all the songs were completely forgettable. I disagree. Thank You Very Much is probably the song that's the most famous from the musical, but I actually like all of the songs. And I think that the story lends itself to a musical because the sentiments are so intense. Scrooge is filled with anger and contempt and bitterness. Then there's his employee, Bob Cratchit, who is poor but filled with dignity and has this son who is probably dying if he doesn't get treatment. So there are a lot of raw emotions in the story, and they lend themselves, I think, very well to song and to people expressing their longing or their sadness, as is done in the movie. And so I like the entire soundtrack, and I really feel like that movie expresses and heightens a lot of the themes in the Dickens story better than any other version, and I enjoy watching it, and I'm always moved by it when I do watch it. His conversion at the end, and all that celebration that takes place, everything in the musical version is ratcheted up from all of the non-musical versions, and I enjoy the movie for that reason. And it's Christmas, and it's a time for those kinds of feelings of family and love and loss and all the rest, and so it's just a well-executed musical as far as I'm concerned. Secondly is It's a Wonderful Life. I've loved this movie. I realize that people have seen it so much that it's easy to just forget how great this movie is. Also another movie not appreciated when it came out in 1946, kind of lost. Some of the critics were a little bit more favorable to it than others, but audiences just didn't go, and so it was basically kind of a box office failure at the time. Some of these movies got the boost that they received because they fell out of their copyright, and that allowed stations to play them incessantly in the 70s and 80s. And so they got played a lot more than others, and that allowed people to find them. But It's a Wonderful Life is a perfect film. I mean, you can break this thing down by scene, by characters, by plot points, and it's a great tutorial to anybody that wants to write a screenplay. It's just pitch perfect from beginning to end. It has some of the finest actors in Hollywood history working and delivering at the level that they're paid to deliver. From Jimmy Stewart to Donna Reed to Barrymore playing Mr. Potter and all the various character actors who contribute to the movie. And it's a Frank Capra film, and he's one of the greatest directors of all time. And it really is a masterpiece of work for him as well. And so many of the things that Frank Capra did in his movies that made them work and that have been mimicked to the point now that, in a class where you're teaching about film, you often have to point out that no one had ever done something like this in a film because what they did was so extraordinary that everyone who came after mimicked it, and now it seems commonplace. And so it becomes hard to appreciate because you see the trick or that maneuver in films all the time. Capra was the master of using a third party in a scene as a cutaway. So he would have a scene in which two characters were talking to each other, but there would be a third person in the room who he allowed to be the audience. Essentially, the third person was the audience, and they could react to what was going on, and that heightened your understanding of the scene. A good example of this in It's a Wonderful Life is after George Bailey has jumped, this is Jimmy Stewart, has jumped into the water to save the angel Clarence, and they're in the toll officer's booth and drying out their clothes, and this is when the angel is revealing to Jimmy Stewart's character, George Bailey, that he is an angel, which of course George Bailey does not believe. And they have this back and forth, and every time Clarence says something bizarre, hinting that he's an angel or just explaining that he's an angel, they cut to the toll booth gentleman who is sitting there off to the side, and he's having these very kind of strange reactions to what the angel is saying. And it's a device that allows the audience to laugh and to understand that, to give them the cue that what's happening in this particular case is bizarre. And usually it's done for comic effect and beautifully executed in that scene with this guy eventually sort of his chair collapsing because he's in such shock at what he's hearing. He falls backwards in his chair. It's a great moment. But this is a device that Frank Capra used repeatedly in his films, and you see it all the time in movies now. A great movie about a man who believes that his life of sacrificing for others, of always putting other people first, had basically resulted in his destruction, and that it was all pointless, and that he'd never achieved any of his dreams. And ultimately, it's revealed to him the impact that he'd had on other people and how important he was and his life was in the world. And it couldn't be a better Christmas theme. And as I said, it's executed by some of the finest actors and actresses that Hollywood has ever produced. They work wonderfully as an ensemble. It's an exhilarating film. And I think that sometimes we've just seen something so many times that it starts to lose its impact. And so for that reason, I actually don't watch the film every Christmas. I usually try to go 3 or 4, maybe sometimes as much as 5 years between watching it, because I don't want to become so numb to the film that I can't enjoy just how wonderful it is. And lastly, and maybe this will come as a surprise, maybe not, is the 1988 Bill Murray movie Scrooged, which is a very tongue-in-cheek, lighthearted take on the Dickens story, and just 180 degrees away from the musical version with Albert Finney, which takes itself very seriously. Bill Murray has made a series of comedies that are just absolute classics, from Caddyshack to other things, and it's his wit and his sarcasm and the way he kind of stumbles through the whole thing. Again, beautifully supported by an ensemble cast from Carol Kane to John Forsythe and others, all delivering just what they need to, in Bobcat Goldthwait and others, to support the structure of the film. It's got a lot of great laughs. One of the great things about that movie is the laughs are just, the zingers are just coming so fast that sometimes you have to roll it back because you're still laughing from the previous line. Now, if you don't find Bill Murray funny, then it doesn't work. But if you do, it's got to be one of his greatest achievements. I saw that the White House Christmas lighting, the Christmas tree lighting ceremony was on the TV the other day, and that's a wonderful annual tradition, and it was nice to see the president and his wife lighting the tree and sitting there enjoying the music and the whole process. If you get a chance to catch that, I think it's going to repeat a few times on, I think it may be on Hallmark. So we're just about out of time. You can always find this podcast if you search for The Horrible Deplorable Show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, YouTube, and any other app most other apps that you love to listen to your podcasts on. This is a labor of love, and I don't just say that. This is not just a tagline at the end. We really need your help to grow, so I'm hoping that you will recommend, if you enjoy this podcast, I'm hoping you'll recommend it to someone else you know who will love it just as much. Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.